They were never supposed to exist. No records, no names, no graves. History tried to erase them, and they helped. For centuries, they moved through the darkness of feudal Japan like ghosts, shaping wars, toppling rulers, and vanishing before anyone could prove they were ever there. Some say they were demons. Others say they were gods. The truth is far more dangerous than either. This is the real story of the ninja. For most people, the word ninja conjures a very specific image: black mask, throwing stars, silent assassin dropping from the ceiling. Hollywood gave us that image. Video games reinforced it. And pop culture turned it into a costume. But strip away the mythology, the movies, and the merchandise, and what remains is something far more extraordinary. A real historical tradition. A genuine underground network of warriors, spies, farmers, and philosophers who operated in the shadows of one of history's most brutal and beautiful civilizations. They were called shinobi, and for nearly 500 years, they shaped the fate of Japan in ways that most history books still refuse to fully acknowledge. Tonight, we go deeper than any documentary has dared. 100 facts. 2 hours. No shortcuts. From the misty origins of ninjutsu to the secret techniques that modern special forces still study today, from the weapons you've never heard of to the psychological tactics that made these warriors unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Stay with us, because the deeper we go, the stranger and more remarkable this story becomes. The word most people use, ninja, is actually a later, somewhat simplified reading of the same Chinese characters that, in classical Japanese, were pronounced shinobi no mano. Translated literally, it means one who endures, or one who steals away. That etymology alone tells you everything about how these people saw themselves, not as warriors of glory, not as champions seeking honor on the battlefield, but as survivors. Endurers. People who operated in a world that wanted them dead, and endured anyway. The character for shinobi is composed of 2 parts, a blade and a heart. A blade positioned directly over a heart. Some scholars interpret this as to conceal, others as to persevere through pain. Either way, it paints a portrait of a tradition built not on aggression, but on extraordinary inner discipline. The ninja did not chase glory. They outlasted it. The birthplace of the ninja is not a palace, not a military fortress, not a grand dojo carved from ancient cedar. It is a valley, specifically the mountainous, geographically isolated region of Iga, in what is now Mie Prefecture, and its neighboring province, Kōka, in present-day Shiga. These were not prosperous lands. The terrain was too rugged for large armies to move through easily, which meant the local clans had to develop their own methods of defense and intelligence gathering. Cut off from the political mainstream of Japan, the people of Iga and Kōka evolved a radically independent culture, one rooted in guerrilla warfare, local knowledge, and collective survival rather than individual samurai glory. They mapped every mountain trail. They knew every seasonal fog pattern. The land itself became their greatest weapon, and over generations, they learned to use it with a precision that no outside force could replicate. Geography didn't just shape the ninja. It created them. The oldest known written reference to ninja-style operatives in Japanese history doesn't use the word shinobi at all. It appears in the Nihon Shoki, one of Japan's earliest chronicles, compiled in 720 AD, and describes a figure named Otomono Sahido, said to have infiltrated an enemy camp through stealth and cunning rather than open combat. This was nearly 900 years before the ninja tradition would reach its peak. Historians debate whether Otomono Sahido represents a true precursor to the shinobi or simply a warrior who happened to use covert tactics. But the presence of this figure in Japan's earliest formal historical record suggests something important. The philosophy that would eventually become ninjutsu did not emerge suddenly. It grew slowly, across centuries of conflict, from a recurring human realization that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply not be seen. The ninja was not invented. The ninja was remembered. To understand the ninja, you must first understand what they were not, and that means understanding the samurai. The samurai operated under Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code that valued open combat, personal honor, and dying beautifully in battle above almost everything else. To deceive an enemy was, to the samurai, deeply dishonorable. To strike from hiding was shameful. To run from a fight was unthinkable. The ninja existed in deliberate, philosophical opposition to all of this. Where the samurai sought glory, the ninja sought results. Where the samurai announced their presence with armor and battle cries, the ninja removed every trace of their existence. This was not cowardice. It was an entirely different philosophy of power. And the tension between these two traditions defined much of feudal Japan's shadow history. Samurai needed the ninja. They hired them, used them, relied on them. And then, because it was politically convenient, they pretended the ninja didn't exist. Here is one of the most important and most frequently overlooked truths about the ninja. The majority of them were farmers. Not full-time assassins. Not professional shadow warriors maintained by wealthy lords in secret underground compounds. Farmers. Peasants. Ordinary villagers who, by necessity, developed extraordinary skills. In Iga and Kōka, entire communities practiced what we might today call dual life existence, tending crops, raising families, participating in village life, while also maintaining networks of covert intelligence, defensive tactics, and, when necessary, offensive capability. This arrangement was deeply practical. A farmer is invisible in a way that a trained soldier never is. A peasant pushing a cart through a checkpoint attracts no suspicion. A woman selling vegetables in a castle town is nobody. And nobody, historically speaking, can go absolutely anywhere. The genius of the ninja tradition was that it understood the power of social invisibility long before any intelligence agency in the modern world put that principle into a training manual. The Iga province would eventually become the epicenter of ninjutsu's development, and much of this is owed to one extraordinary period of history, the Iga Revolt of 1579. In that year, the warlord Oda Nobunaga, one of the most powerful and ruthless military figures in Japanese history, sent his son Nobukatsu to subdue the fiercely independent shinobi clans of Iga. The first campaign ended in catastrophe for Nobukatsu's forces. The Iga warriors used the terrain, guerrilla ambushes, fire, and psychological tactics to devastate an army far larger than anything they could field in open battle. It was a humiliation. 2 years later, Nobunaga himself returned with a force estimated at 40,000 soldiers. This time, the result was different. The Iga clans were crushed. Villages burned. Survivors scattered across Japan, carrying their knowledge with them like seeds dispersed by fire. In the darkest moment of ninja history, they paradoxically spread their tradition further than they ever could have in peace. After the destruction of Iga, thousands of shinobi became ronin, masterless wanderers, scattering across feudal Japan in search of new employment, new protection, or simply survival. Many found their way into the service of other powerful lords, bringing their skills with them like a portable arsenal. Others formed new covert communities in remote regions, adapting their traditions to new landscapes and new political environments. And some, fascinatingly, became monks. The Buddhist temple networks of medieval Japan provided extraordinary cover for intelligence operations, offering legitimate reasons to travel across provincial borders, access to literate, educated communities, and a social identity that invited trust rather than suspicion. A wandering monk could carry messages, conduct reconnaissance, and recruit informants in ways that no soldier could. This intersection of spiritual life and covert operation was not incidental. It was deeply embedded in the ninja worldview, which held that mastery of the inner world, the mind, the emotions, the spirit, was just as essential as mastery of any physical technique. Ninjutsu, the technical tradition of the shinobi, was never simply a fighting art. It was a comprehensive survival curriculum covering an astonishing range of disciplines. At its core were 18 categories of skills known as the ninja juhaki, which included everything from unarmed combat and sword technique to meteorology, horsemanship, and the use of explosives. But some of the most remarkable components were the ones rarely mentioned in popular accounts. Pharmacology, for instance. The shinobi tradition included extensive knowledge of medicinal and poisonous plants, how to use them for healing, for sedation, for creating distractions, and in some cases, for killing without any trace of violence. A ninja operating in a castle kitchen didn't need a blade. They needed chemistry. And they had it. The systematic cultivation and application of botanical knowledge gave trained shinobi a dimension of power that was almost entirely invisible and almost entirely impossible to defend against by anyone who didn't know it existed. One of the most enduring questions about the ninja tradition is where it ultimately came from, what its original intellectual and philosophical roots were. The answer, backed by serious historical scholarship, points strongly toward China. Specifically, toward the strategic philosophy of Sun Tzu's Art of War, which reached Japan in the 7th and 8th centuries through Buddhist and diplomatic channels. Sun Tzu's emphasis on deception, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and the principle that the greatest victory is one achieved without direct confrontation all map with extraordinary precision onto the core values of the shinobi tradition. Beyond Sun Tzu, Chinese military manuals on espionage, including detailed texts on the 5 types of spies and their operational methods, appear to have been studied and adapted by the early Iga and Kōka clans. The ninja, in other words, were not a spontaneous Japanese invention. They were a creative synthesis, an indigenous response to universal strategic wisdom, filtered through the specific social and geographical conditions of medieval Japan. Training to become a full shinobi operative was a process that began not in adolescence, but in early childhood. Children born into ninja families, and ninjutsu in Iga and Kōka was largely hereditary, passed through family lineages called ryu, began physical conditioning almost from the moment they could walk. Stories preserved in later training manuals describe children being encouraged to leap over progressively higher hemp plants as they grew, the plant and the child developing together, a living measuring stick of physical progress. Balance training, breath control, endurance conditioning, and the development of spatial awareness were integrated into daily play in ways that the children themselves may not have immediately recognized as training. By the time a young shinobi was old enough to be formally instructed in operational techniques, their body had already been quietly shaped by years of deliberate physical development. The genius of this system was that the training was invisible, even to the trainee. Stillness was one of the most rigorously cultivated skills in the entire shinobi curriculum, and understanding why reveals something profound about how the ninja understood human perception. Most people, when hiding, instinctively focus on not being seen. The shinobi understood that hearing, smell, and movement were equally dangerous. A trained operative could remain motionless for hours, not fidgeting, not swallowing audibly, not allowing the microtremors of muscle fatigue to rustle grass or creak a floorboard. This required extraordinary physical conditioning and an equally extraordinary mental discipline. Accounts in surviving training texts describe specific meditation techniques designed to slow the heart rate, reduce breathing, and enter a state of calm awareness where the body produces minimal heat, minimal sound, and minimal scent. Modern special forces training has arrived at similar conclusions through entirely different routes. The lesson that history keeps teaching and keeps being forgotten is this: the most dangerous person in any room is often the one you cannot find. Infiltrating a fortified Japanese castle was considered one of the most challenging operational tasks a shinobi could undertake, and the manuals that survive suggest they approached it with what we would today recognize as systematic intelligence preparation of the environment. Before any physical entry was attempted, extensive reconnaissance was conducted, sometimes over weeks or months. The guard rotation patterns, the dogs, the placement of torches, the squeaky floorboards and the silent ones, the servants who worked late, the samurai who drank too much, all of this was catalogued with patient precision. The famous nightingale floors, ugusabari, installed in some Japanese castle corridors were specifically designed to detect ninja infiltration. These floors were engineered to produce a chirping sound when walked on, due to clamps beneath the boards that rubbed against nails. But shinobi countermeasures existed. Accounts describe specific foot placement techniques designed to step directly onto the joists beneath the boards, bypassing the very mechanism the floor was designed to trigger. The throwing star, the shuriken, is perhaps the most iconic symbol of the ninja in modern imagination. But the reality of how it was actually used would surprise most people who picture it as a lethal long-range weapon. In practice, the shuriken was rarely, if ever, thrown to kill. The distances involved, the unpredictability of rotation, and the relatively small size of the weapon made it poorly suited for lethality against an armored or even a clothed opponent at any meaningful range. What it was extraordinarily useful for was disruption. A shuriken thrown at a pursuer's face forced them to flinch, to raise their hands, to break their stride, buying precious seconds for an escaping operative to gain distance or change direction. Some texts describe shuriken being coated with irritants or mild toxins to enhance this disruptive effect. The ninja understood something that modern combat psychologists have studied extensively: you don't always need to injure an opponent to defeat them. You simply need to break their focus at the right moment. That instant of hesitation is all the darkness needs. Fire was both the ninja's greatest tool and their greatest adversary. As a weapon, it was devastatingly effective in ways that far exceeded any blade. A single operative with incendiary knowledge could destroy a grain store, collapse a supply line, trigger mass confusion in a fortified encampment, or create a diversion large enough to cover a full extraction operation. The shinobi tradition included detailed pyrotechnic knowledge, techniques for creating slow-burning fuses, flash powders, smoke screens of different colors, and incendiary mixtures that could be delivered silently. Some of these formulations bear a striking resemblance to contemporaneous Chinese military chemistry, suggesting either direct transmission of knowledge or remarkably parallel development. But fire was also the enemy's most powerful tool against the shinobi. The darkness that protected them vanished the moment a torch was lit. More than one shinobi operation, according to historical accounts, was compromised not by a clever guard or an alert dog, but by the simple, humble, utterly democratic flicker of a single burning flame. Among the most fascinating and consistently underrepresented figures in the history of the ninja tradition is the kunoichi, the female operative. The very word is constructed from the three strokes that form the kanji character for woman, and what it represented in operational terms was a form of intelligence capability that no male shinobi, however skilled, could replicate. In feudal Japanese society, women occupied social spaces that were categorically closed to men. They attended noble ladies in private chambers. They worked as servants in domestic quarters deep within castle compounds, far past any checkpoint a male operative would ever reach. They were, by social convention, largely invisible to the men who held power, overlooked, underestimated, and therefore extraordinarily dangerous. The kunoichi's primary tools were not blades or explosives. They were social intelligence, emotional manipulation, patient observation, and the fundamental human tendency of powerful men to assume that women pose no threat. History's most underestimated misconception has always been a very effective weapon. The shinobi developed sophisticated systems of communication and information encoding that in some respects anticipate modern intelligence tradecraft by several centuries. Messages were written in code, some simple substitution ciphers, others more complex systems using Buddhist iconography or agricultural terminology as cover language. The physical medium of the message was carefully chosen. Rice paper that dissolved in water within seconds of being submerged was used for the most sensitive communications. Messages could be hidden in everyday objects, inside bamboo stalks, within the binding of a traveler's pack, sewn into clothing hems. Certain surviving accounts describe systems of dead drops, predetermined locations where information could be deposited and retrieved without the sender and receiver ever being seen together. The challenge of communicating securely across hostile territory, under conditions where capture meant not just death but torture, and potentially the betrayal of an entire operational network, drove the shinobi tradition toward a level of information security sophistication that is genuinely remarkable for its historical period. Information, they understood, was a weapon. And like all weapons, it had to be protected. Weather was not merely something the ninja endured, it was something they studied, anticipated, and weaponized. The ninjutsu curriculum included systematic training in meteorology because the natural world provided cover, concealment, and operational opportunities that no human ingenuity alone could manufacture. Rain-muffled sound. Thunder provided cover for movement. Low cloud and fog neutralized the effectiveness of torches and visual sentries. A moonless night in an overcast sky was, to a trained shinobi, what a fully equipped laboratory is to a modern scientist. A perfectly controlled environment for precision work. Surviving training texts describe methods for reading weather signs, wind patterns, animal behavior, cloud formations, to predict conditions up to several days in advance. Operations were planned around weather windows in ways that mirror modern special forces mission planning. The shinobi did not wait for the perfect moment to arrive. They studied nature until they could predict when that moment was coming, and then they were already in position, perfectly still, waiting in the dark. Disguise was not merely a practical tool in the shinobi tradition, it was a philosophical discipline with its own extensive codified theory. The concept of shirchi-hoda, or the 7 ways of going, described 7 fundamental social identities that a shinobi operative could assume: the traveling Buddhist monk, the itinerant performer, the merchant, the craftsman, the Shinto priest, the ordinary farmer, and the wandering samurai without allegiance. Each identity came with its own behavioral requirements, its own vocabulary, its own social conventions, and its own set of appropriate emotional responses to various situations. Maintaining a false identity under pressure, in front of suspicious guards, hostile locals, or intelligent enemies, required not merely a costume, but a complete psychological transformation. Shinobi were trained to inhabit these identities so completely that no inconsistency in behavior, speech pattern, or emotional response would betray them. It was, in modern psychological terms, a form of method acting applied to matters of life, death, and state security. The makibishi is one of those ninja tools that sounds almost quaint when described, and reveals itself as brilliant when understood. These were small caltrops, spiked metal or ceramic objects, sometimes made from dried water chestnuts, scattered on the ground to delay pursuers. Simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. The makibishi were designed to penetrate the thin soles of traditional Japanese footwear, creating immediate, painful, and disorienting injury in any pursuer moving at speed through an area where they had been scattered. In a chase, that most primal and terrifying of operational scenarios, a few seconds of pain and confusion could mean the difference between escape and capture. More sophisticated versions were coated with substances that promoted infection, meaning that even a minor puncture could have serious consequences for anyone unlucky enough to encounter one. The lesson embedded in this small, humble, wickedly effective tool is one that appears throughout the shinobi tradition. You do not need to defeat your enemy. You simply need to slow them down long enough that the darkness can swallow you whole. Of all the operational skills in the ninjutsu curriculum, intelligence gathering, choho, was considered the most critical and the most highly developed. Physical combat, however impressive, was a last resort. Information was the primary product, and gathering it required patience of an almost meditative quality. Shinobi accounts describe operatives spending entire nights suspended above meeting rooms, pressed into wall cavities, or hidden within ceiling spaces, perfectly still, breathing shallowly, memorizing conversations verbatim over periods of hours. The human body, held in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, generates an enormous physiological pressure to move, to shift weight, to relieve muscle tension. Overcoming this pressure was, by all surviving accounts, one of the most difficult and most rigorously trained aspects of the entire curriculum. The mind had to dominate the body so completely that discomfort became not merely tolerable, but effectively imperceptible. And what was gathered in those long, dark, silent hours of listening was often worth more than anything a blade could achieve. The psychology of the ninja extended deeply into understanding the minds of the people they were working against, a discipline sometimes called nyukyo, or entering the mind. Before any mission that required sustained contact with targets, shinobi operatives were trained to study their subjects' psychological profiles with the same rigor that they studied castle floor plans. What motivated the target? What frightened them? What were their predictable responses to specific types of social pressure? Which guards were loyal and which were resentful? Which noble was ambitious enough to be manipulated, and which was content enough to be dangerous? This intelligence, gathered through observation and informant networks over time, allowed shinobi to shape situations rather than simply react to them, to create conditions where the target's own psychology became a mechanism that worked against them. It is a principle that modern intelligence agencies have formalized under various names, but the shinobi tradition articulated it centuries earlier, in mountain valleys far removed from any modern concept of state intelligence. Assassination, the act that popular culture most closely associates with the ninja, was in historical reality far less common and far more carefully considered than films and legends suggest. It was expensive, high-risk, and operationally complex. It also had significant political consequences that were not always in the client's interest. Killing a powerful lord could destabilize an entire regional power structure in ways that proved counterproductive to the people who ordered the death. The shinobi, being pragmatic professionals operating within complex political webs, understood this. Surviving accounts from the Sengoku period, Japan's age of warring states, suggest that the majority of shinobi contracts involved intelligence gathering, psychological operations, and strategic disruption rather than targeted killing. When assassination was commissioned, the approach was rarely the cinematic rooftop ambush. It was far more likely to be a slow, patient operation conducted through infiltration of the target's household over weeks or months, establishing trust, identifying vulnerability, and choosing the moment not for its dramatic impact, but for its absolute certainty. The spiritual and philosophical dimension of the shinobi tradition is among its most genuinely surprising aspects, and the one most thoroughly stripped from popular representations. Many of the most important ninja lineages maintained deep connections to esoteric Buddhist and Shinto practice, particularly a syncretic tradition known as shugendo, a path of ascetic mountain practice combining Buddhist, Shinto, and Taoist elements. The mountain practitioners called yamabushi who walked the severe landscapes of Japan's interior ranges, fasting, meditating, and subjecting themselves to extreme physical ordeals, shared enormous common ground with the shinobi tradition's emphasis on mental and physical mastery. Some historians argue that the yamabushi and the early shinobi lineages were not merely parallel traditions but were actively intertwined, that many of the men and women who were shinobi by operational function were also yamabushi by spiritual practice. If true, it suggests something extraordinary, that the ninja did not merely use the mountains as terrain. They used them as teachers. Political manipulation, shaping events from positions of invisibility without ever declaring a side, was one of the highest forms of shinobi craft. Some of the most impactful ninja operations in Japanese history were not infiltrations or assassinations, but sophisticated influence campaigns, spreading carefully crafted rumors through communities, engineering apparent accidents that pushed political situations in desired directions, creating the appearance of supernatural omens to demoralize enemy populations or bolster friendly ones. The feudal Japanese population, deeply steeped in superstitious belief, was remarkably vulnerable to well-designed psychological operations. A ghost sighting that spread panic through an enemy castle. A prophecy, supposedly emanating from a respected shrine, that discouraged a warlord from taking a particular military action. The apparent death of a general's favorite horse on the night before a critical campaign, whether engineered or simply attributed to shinobi action after the fact, that shattered morale before a single arrow was fired. These operations left no fingerprints. And that, of course, was precisely the point. The Kōka region, Iga's neighboring homeland of the shinobi tradition, maintained a fascinating parallel development to Iga's culture, producing its own distinct lineages, techniques, and philosophical emphases. While Iga became historically associated with the most covert and offensive aspects of ninjutsu, Kōka developed a reputation particularly strong in pharmacology, medicine, and what might be termed support operations, the logistical and intelligence infrastructure that made frontline covert operations possible. Kōka shinobi were reportedly renowned for their knowledge of herbs, poisons, and medicines, a tradition so strongly maintained that the region remained a center of pharmaceutical knowledge well into the modern era. The neighboring provinces, though sharing an overarching tradition, were not identical. They competed, collaborated, and occasionally fought each other, creating a dynamic that drove both lineages to continuously develop and refine their capabilities. Competition, even between allies, has always been one of history's most reliable engines of innovation. Physical conditioning in the shinobi tradition extended far beyond combat fitness into what we would today recognize as specialized athletic development targeting the very specific demands of covert operations. The ability to run silently, not merely quietly, but with the footfall impact of a cat rather than a human, was the product of years of specific training. Jumping ability was cultivated through progressive methods far ahead of their time, developing both explosive power and the capacity to land without sound or significant impact force. Upper body strength sufficient to support the body's full weight on fingertips, not palms, but fingertips, while pressed against a wall or ceiling was reportedly a standard milestone in advanced training. The physical capacity to slow one's own heartbeat and metabolic rate through deliberate breathing technique was not a metaphor or a legend. Modern sports science confirms that trained practitioners of certain breath control systems can achieve measurable reductions in resting heart rate at will. The shinobi had been applying this principle operationally for generations before Western science defined the mechanism. The intelligence networks maintained by the major shinobi clans were, at their operational peak, organizational achievements of considerable sophistication. They were not simply collections of individual operatives, they were multi-layered systems with embedded informants, relay communication chains, regional safe houses, and what modern intelligence terminology would call cutouts, intermediary contacts who could pass information between operational cells without any single person knowing more than their own part of the network. The merchants who traveled the roads of feudal Japan were particularly valuable in this architecture. They had legitimate reasons to be everywhere, to talk to everyone, and to observe the movement of armies, the state of supplies, and the mood of local populations. A shinobi intelligence network that controlled key positions in a regional merchant community could effectively monitor the entire political and military situation of a province without a single operative ever approaching a fortified position. Information, gathered from 100 ordinary conversations in 100 ordinary market stalls, assembled itself into a picture of remarkable clarity. Underwater capability was a documented and significant component of the shinobi operational toolkit, far beyond what most people picture when they imagine feudal-era covert operations. Japan is an island nation, and the medieval period's military geography was heavily shaped by rivers, coastal waters, moats, and harbor approaches. A shinobi who could operate confidently in and underwater had access to entire dimensions of the battlefield that were effectively invisible to conventional military thinking. Training texts describe extended breath-holding capacity developed through systematic practice, as well as techniques for moving underwater with minimal disturbance to the surface, the ripple and bubble patterns of an underwater swimmer being, in still water, clearly visible from the bank. Specialized equipment was developed. Certain floating devices disguised as debris or natural water vegetation, hollow reed breathing tubes that are among the earliest documented personal diving aids in any military tradition anywhere in the world. The moat around a castle was not, to a trained shinobi, a barrier. It was an entrance. One of the most psychologically sophisticated tools in the shinobi arsenal was the systematic deployment of confusion, not chaos, but precisely calibrated disorientation. The concept of inyo, drawing from the Taoist principle of opposing forces, was applied operationally to mean creating situations where an opponent's expectations were violated in ways that paralyzed decision-making. If guards expected an attack from outside, the disruption came from within. If an enemy anticipated silence, there was sudden, disorienting noise. If they anticipated noise, the silence that fell was somehow worse. This principle was applied at every scale, from individual combat, where unpredictable rhythm disrupted an opponent's defensive timing, to large-scale strategic operations, where carefully engineered false information led entire armies in the wrong direction. The goal was never simply to surprise. It was to create a cognitive state in the opponent where their training and experience, their most powerful defensive resources, became liabilities rather than assets, because those resources were built to respond to a world that the shinobi had just quietly rearranged. The architecture of medieval Japan, specifically the design of castles, manor houses, and fortified compounds, evolved in direct, dynamic response to the threat of shinobi infiltration. This created one of history's most fascinating examples of coevolution between attacker and defender, each innovation by one side generating a countermeasure from the other. The nightingale floors have already been mentioned. Beyond them, architects developed hidden rooms designed not to conceal inhabitants but to conceal guards, spaces inside walls where armed men could wait silently until an infiltrator passed by, then emerged to cut off retreat. Windows were designed with specific bar configurations that blocked adult human passage without appearing, from outside, to be security features. The placement of lights and shadows was calculated to create pools of illumination that any moving intruder would have to cross. And yet, for every architectural defense innovated, the training manuals document a corresponding countermeasure, a technique, a tool, or a timing strategy that neutralized it. The castle and the shinobi were, in a sense, building each other. The Battle of Okahazama in 1560 is celebrated in Japanese history as one of the most stunning military upsets ever recorded, Oda Nobunaga's small force destroying the vastly superior army of Imagawa Yoshimoto in a surprise attack during a thunderstorm. What is less celebrated and rarely examined is the critical role that shinobi intelligence played in creating the conditions for that victory. In the weeks before the battle, Nobunaga's information network, staffed by covert operatives embedded in the region around Imagawa's advancing column, provided him with remarkably precise intelligence on the enemy army's location, numbers, disposition, and crucially, the location of Yoshimoto's personal command tent. Without that intelligence, the surprise attack that changed the course of Japanese history could never have been launched with the precision required. Nobunaga's famous brilliance as a commander was real. But behind it, invisible as always, were the shinobi whose work made that brilliance possible, and who received, in the historical record, almost none of the credit. The concept of metsuke, sometimes translated as fixing the eyes, was a critical component of shinobi perceptual training that has profound implications for how we understand human attention and awareness. Rather than focusing intently on any specific object or point, the trained shinobi cultivated a state of wide, soft, peripheral awareness, a mode of vision that the Japanese called enzen no metsuke, or gazing at distant mountains. This diffuse visual field dramatically increased sensitivity to movement at the edges of vision, the precise type of movement that a person attempting stealth would generate, and the precise type of movement that an intent, focused gaze most commonly misses. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that peripheral vision is significantly more sensitive to motion than central foveal vision, and that the intensity of focused attention can paradoxically suppress awareness of stimuli that fall outside its narrow target. The shinobi had built an entire perceptual training system around this principle centuries before the neuroscience existed to explain why it worked. The kunai, another of those weapons firmly lodged in popular imagination as purely a throwing weapon, was in operational reality one of the most versatile multi-purpose tools in the shinobi toolkit, and throwing it was arguably its least important function. Originally derived from a simple farming and masonry implement used for digging, prying, and cutting plant material, the kunai's flat blade and ring pommel made it extraordinarily adaptable. It could be used as a digging tool for creating hand and footholds in stone surfaces. It functioned as a pry bar for opening doors, window bars, and floor panels. It could be driven into a castle wall and used as a hook for climbing ropes. It served as a general utility blade for cutting, carving, and preparing materials in the field. And yes, it could be thrown or used as a thrusting weapon in close quarters. What the kunai represents, more than any specific technique, is the shinobi's fundamental approach to equipment. Every tool should perform multiple functions, because a professional working alone in hostile territory cannot carry everything. Simplicity and adaptability above all. The relationship between the ninja tradition and Japan's religious landscape was far more complex and far more central than is generally appreciated. Many of the most important shinobi lineages maintained not just connections to Buddhist temples, but actual operational bases within temple complexes, a relationship of mutual convenience that served both parties. The temples gained protection, information, and practical support from their shinobi affiliates. The shinobi gained sanctuary, social cover, network access through the temple's legitimate connections to communities across wide geographic areas, and, critically, the services of literate, educated monks who could assist with the coded records, strategic documents, and information analysis that sophisticated intelligence operations require. Several major shinobi ryu preserved their most sensitive technical knowledge within texts that were deliberately formatted to resemble Buddhist religious documents, knowing that only those trained to read the embedded secondary meaning would extract the operational content. Religion as encryption. Faith as cover. It is an application of spiritual infrastructure to covert purposes that appears, in various forms, in intelligence traditions across almost every major civilization in history. The transmission of ninjutsu knowledge across generations was governed by a principle of extraordinary secrecy that had profound implications for the tradition's long-term survival. Unlike the major schools of samurai swordsmanship, which often maintained formal records of lineage, technique, and student achievement, the most sensitive elements of shinobi knowledge were transmitted orally, master to selected student, in private, under conditions of sworn secrecy. Written records were kept, but they were deliberately incomplete, frameworks that could only be fully understood and applied by someone who had received the corresponding oral transmission. This system provided remarkable security against the theft of the tradition's most important knowledge, since any written document captured by an enemy would reveal only a fraction of the full picture. But it also created the tradition's greatest vulnerability. If the master died before transmission was complete, that knowledge died with them. The history of ninjutsu is, in this way, also a history of what was lost, skills, strategies, and insights that existed once, and then simply did not exist anymore. Animal behavior was not merely something the shinobi observed passively, it was actively integrated into both training and operational methodology in ways that reveal a deeply sophisticated understanding of the natural world. Birds, particularly crows and ravens, were studied for their alarm behavior. Understanding exactly which calls indicated genuine threat versus routine disturbance meant a covert operative could assess the security status of an area from a distance, without ever approaching it, simply by interpreting what the local bird population was communicating. Dogs, as already noted, were the primary animal adversary of the shinobi, and detailed counter-dog protocols were a standard part of advanced training. But animals were also allies. Accounts describe operatives who maintained such detailed knowledge of specific animals' habits that they could predict, with considerable accuracy, when those animals would provide natural cover for noise or movement. A flock of birds taking sudden flight. A dog barking at its own reflection in a water trough. Nature's rhythms, read with sufficient depth, become a language, and the shinobi were among its most fluent speakers. Among the surviving primary sources of the shinobi tradition, none is more extraordinary or more studied than the Bansenshuki, a comprehensive ninjutsu manual compiled in 1676 by Fujibayashi Yasutake, a master of the Iga tradition. Running to 10 volumes, it is the most complete written record of shinobi knowledge in existence, covering philosophy, strategy, intelligence methodology, equipment, psychological technique, and the ethical framework within which these skills were meant to be applied. Reading it is a disorienting experience, because it is simultaneously a military manual, a philosophical text, a technical reference, and something that reads, in certain passages, almost like a meditation guide. Fujibayashi was at pains to emphasize that ninjutsu without moral grounding was not merely dangerous, it was fundamentally flawed. The skills, he argued, could only achieve their full potential when wielded by a person of genuine inner discipline and clear ethical purpose. For a tradition commonly depicted as morally neutral or openly malevolent, this emphasis on virtue as a prerequisite for mastery is consistently surprising to modern readers. The concept of nin, endurance, perseverance, the capacity to sustain effort through difficulty without complaint or visible strain, was not merely a practical value in the shinobi tradition. It was its philosophical heart. Everything else, the physical skills, the intelligence techniques, the psychological methods, was built on this foundation. And nin was understood to operate on 3 levels. The first was physical endurance, the body's capacity to sustain pain, fatigue, cold, heat, hunger, and discomfort without degradation of function. The second was emotional endurance, the mind's capacity to sustain pressure, fear, grief, and moral complexity without becoming paralyzed or reckless. The third, and by many accounts the most difficult, was what might be translated as social endurance, the capacity to be misunderstood, to be underestimated, to be invisible, to receive no recognition or credit for work of extraordinary difficulty and consequence, and to find that not merely acceptable but philosophically correct. The ninja's greatest skill was, in the end, the willingness to be unknown. The tactical use of darkness was, for the shinobi, both an art and a science, and their understanding of it extended far beyond simply operating at night. They studied the phases of the moon with the attention of astronomers, since moon phase determined both the quality of available light and the shadows that light would cast. A quarter moon created specific shadow geometries in different types of terrain that a trained operative could map in advance and use for sequential concealment, moving from shadow to shadow in a practiced choreography that brought them across an open space without ever stepping into illumination. Overcast nights were preferred for long movements across exposed terrain, because the diffuse, indirect light of a clouded sky created soft, poorly defined shadows with no strong contrast, reducing the visual signature of a moving figure dramatically. Starlight, by contrast, created conditions that experienced nocturnal operatives found almost as useful as a torch, once their eyes had fully adapted. The shinobi lived in darkness the way fish live in water, not despite it, but because of what it offered. Among the 7 disguise identities of the shinobi, the traveling performer, Tsurugakusher, deserves special attention because it provided a uniquely comprehensive form of operational cover. Performers in feudal Japan were socially ambiguous figures. They occupied a space outside the rigid class hierarchy that governed most social interactions, which meant they moved with a freedom that other identities could not easily achieve. A performer had a legitimate reason to be in a lord's great hall, the very interior of the most heavily defended part of the compound. They had a reason to engage in conspicuous physical activity that would otherwise draw suspicion, a reason to ask questions about the layout of a building under the guise of planning their performance space, and a reason to have unusual items in their traveling pack. Some historical accounts describe shinobi using theatrical smoke and distraction devices, precursors of the metsubushi, or sight-removing devices, as theatrical props that served a dual purpose. The audience thought they were watching entertainment. They were watching something considerably more precise. The social structure of the major shinobi organizations was notable for how dramatically it differed from the feudal hierarchy that governed virtually every other aspect of Japanese society. Within a shinobi clan, hierarchy existed, but it was largely meritocratic, based on demonstrated skill, reliability, and operational judgment rather than on birth, family connection, or social status. This was radical in a society where a farmer was a farmer, a samurai was a samurai, and the boundaries between these categories were maintained with considerable institutional force. In the shinobi clans of Iga, a farmer's child with exceptional natural aptitude could, in theory, rise to operational leadership. A woman could achieve status and authority impossible anywhere in the surrounding conventional society. The clans could not afford the inefficiency of rigid social hierarchy, because in the work they did, incompetence was not merely embarrassing. It was fatal, and that existential pressure created, within these communities, a form of practical egalitarianism that was genuinely ahead of its time. The role of the shinobi in conventional military campaigns was often far more significant than the popular narrative of shadowy assassination suggests. During the Sengoku period, Japan's extended age of warring states, roughly spanning the 15th through early 17th centuries, major military commanders routinely deployed shinobi units as specialized intelligence, reconnaissance, and disruption assets integrated into broader campaign strategy. Before a major offensive, shinobi operatives would have spent weeks or months in the target region, mapping defensive positions, identifying supply vulnerabilities, assessing the loyalty and morale of local populations, and in some cases conducting targeted operations against key defensive systems. The intelligence they provided shaped campaign plans at the highest level. The disruptions they caused behind enemy lines stretched defensive resources. And when conventional battle was joined, the shinobi's preparatory work had often already determined the outcome, even before the first arrow was fired, before the first war drums sounded across the valley, before the generals even raised their banners. The classic all-black ninja costume, the shinobi shizoku, is real, but its portrayal in popular culture is both simplified and somewhat misleading. The actual garment was designed not for invisibility in generic darkness, but for operational functionality in a range of specific environments. The loose-fitting jacket and trousers were designed to allow unrestricted movement in climbing, running, and combat while producing minimal fabric noise. They were dark, but surviving accounts suggest that very dark blue, midnight blue, was often preferred over pure black, because in actual nighttime conditions, pure black can create a slightly more visible silhouette against a dark sky than deep blue, which more closely matches the color of the night sky itself. The mask, covering the lower face, served multiple functions: concealment of identity, reduction of visible light reflected from skin, and, practically, protection against dust, smoke, and environmental hazards during operations in burning buildings or after detonation of smoke devices. Even the ninja's clothing was a system of precisely considered functional design rather than theatrical symbolism. Among the psychological disciplines taught within the advanced shinobi curriculum was a set of practices collectively known as seimonjutsu, sometimes translated as hypnotic techniques, though this translation requires careful qualification. What these practices actually involved was the systematic exploitation of human attentional and perceptual vulnerabilities to create controllable mental states in targets. Rhythmic verbal patterns, carefully structured eye contact or deliberately avoided eye contact, precise control of personal presence and physical proximity, all of these were used to create conditions of heightened suggestibility in targets, making them more likely to share information, more likely to behave in predictable ways, and more vulnerable to carefully constructed deceptions. Modern social psychology has mapped many of these same mechanisms under clinical terminology: rapport building, cognitive load exploitation, attentional capture. But the shinobi tradition had not simply discovered these mechanisms by accident. It had developed them into a systematic practice, refined through generations of operational application. They had built a working psychology of influence centuries before the academic field existed. The kodadama, the belief that words and sounds carry inherent power, was a concept that the shinobi tradition absorbed from Shinto religious practice and integrated into operational use in genuinely interesting ways. Specific vocal techniques, patterns of sound, rhythm, and resonance were believed to have measurable effects on the psychological states of both the practitioner and those nearby. Whether or not one accepts the metaphysical framework, the practical application was sophisticated. Controlled breathing combined with specific vocal resonance patterns was used to manage the practitioner's own adrenaline response, the physiological cascade of fear that, uncontrolled, degrades fine motor skills and cognitive function in exactly the moments when both are most urgently needed. Properly managed, that same physiological response could be channeled into dramatically enhanced physical performance. The shinobi did not try to eliminate fear. They trained to use it, to transform the body's emergency systems from a source of liability into a source of power at the moment of their choosing. The tanuki gakur, literally hiding like a tanuki, was one of several named concealment techniques that revealed something important about the shinobi's philosophical approach to escape and evasion. Rather than simply running and hiding, the tradition emphasized what might be called environmental integration, becoming not merely hidden, but indistinguishable from the natural environment in ways that survived not just visual inspection, but the more systematic search that followed visual failure. Techniques in this category included controlled stillness combined with specific body positioning that aligned the operative's silhouette with natural forms: a tree trunk, a boulder, a dense shrub. They included specific methods for controlling the micro-movements of the body, breathing, heartbeat-driven muscle tremor, involuntary postural adjustments that could betray a hidden person to a sufficiently careful searcher. And they included something even more subtle: techniques for managing personal presence, or ki, the indefinable quality of there-ness that humans can sometimes sense in another person even without direct sensory evidence. To hide completely, The shinobi believed, you must not merely be unseen. You must become, in some meaningful sense, absent. The pharmacological knowledge within the shinobi tradition encompassed not just poisons and medicines, but an entire category of what might be called operational pharmacology, substances designed to produce specific, controlled, temporary psychological or physiological effects in targets. Substances that produced deep sleep without causing death. Compounds that induced confusion and disorientation without leaving detectable traces. Preparations that created symptoms of illness convincingly enough to remove a key defender from their post without triggering the alarm that an obvious attack would cause. The sophistication of some of these formulations, as reconstructed by modern researchers examining historical texts, is genuinely impressive for the period. Some bear structural resemblance to compounds that modern pharmacology would classify as sedative hypnotics or dissociative agents. How the shinobi tradition developed this knowledge, through systematic empirical testing, through agricultural and herbal traditions, through exchange with Chinese medical practice, remains a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation. But the knowledge itself, in the surviving records, is unambiguous and profoundly unsettling if you think about it for very long. Cold weather operations posed specific challenges that the shinobi tradition addressed with characteristic thoroughness. Snow was, as previously noted, the most treacherous surface for covert movement. Its acoustic properties, its ability to record footprints, and the visibility of a dark figure against white ground all required specific countermeasures. But beyond these tactical challenges, cold itself was an operational variable that had to be managed through both physical preparation and psychological discipline. Extended operations in winter conditions impose enormous physiological stress, caloric depletion, impaired fine motor control due to cold extremities, reduced cognitive function, and the constant, insidious temptation to generate warmth through movement when stillness is operationally required. Training texts address all of these challenges specifically. Dietary preparation before cold weather operations. Specific layering principles for clothing that balanced warmth retention against noise production and freedom of movement. And mental techniques for tolerating cold, for moving the mind's focus away from physical discomfort and into a state of detached awareness that allowed the body to function long past the point where an untrained person would be incapacitated. The principle of Kaijitsu Tenkin-ho, the interchangeability of truth and falsehood as tactical tools, was one of the most philosophically sophisticated concepts in the entire shinobi strategic framework. It held that effective deception is not simply a matter of substituting false information for true information, but of creating a dynamic relationship between the two that the opponent cannot reliably resolve. If you always lie, your opponent learns to invert your communications and extracts truth from them. If you always tell the truth, your opponent trusts you, which sounds desirable until you understand that it makes you predictable. But if you create a situation where truth and falsehood are delivered in patterns that cannot be decoded, the opponent's entire decision-making apparatus becomes unreliable. They cannot trust intelligence. They cannot trust observation. They cannot even fully trust their own judgment. In that state of epistemic uncertainty, the initiative shifts entirely to the person who created the uncertainty, and that person was, ideally, watching from somewhere very close by, waiting to see which decision their confused opponent would make. Roof navigation was a specialized skill set within the broader shinobi movement curriculum, and its sophistication reflected the fact that castle and compound rooftops were not simply elevated hiding places, they were operational highways. Moving across clay roof tiles without generating sound required mastery of weight distribution and a specific crawling technique that placed minimal, carefully controlled pressure on the tile surface to avoid the ceramic creak that full body weight would produce. Gaps between roof sections, decorative architectural features, and the structural joins of different building elements were all mapped and catalogued during the reconnaissance phase as potential handholds, transition points, and concealment positions. The angles and sight lines from rooftop positions were understood with precision, not just what the operative could see from above, but critically, what the guards below could see looking up. The human visual system, it turns out, is significantly less sensitive to threats arriving from above and behind than from the front and sides. a perceptual bias that rooftop-oriented shinobi technique deliberately and systematically exploited. The concept of the jonin, the highest rank within the shinobi organizational hierarchy, is one of the tradition's most fascinating and least understood elements. Unlike the chunin who managed field operations and the genin who executed them, the jonin occupied a position that was, by design, almost entirely removed from the visible operational world. They were the strategists, the decision-makers, the keepers of the tradition's deepest knowledge, and they typically maintained their position through a combination of genuine wisdom, carefully managed reputation, and an information advantage so complete that their subordinates frequently did not fully understand how decisions were being made. The most effective jonin, by all historical accounts, were those whose influence was most completely invisible, who shaped events through chains of consequence so carefully constructed that the cause of any particular outcome could never be reliably traced back to them. This was not merely operational security. It was a philosophical position that true power expressed through concealment, and that the leader most capable of remaining unknown was, paradoxically, the most secure. The maritime dimension of shinobi operations is rarely discussed, yet Japan's geography, an archipelago of islands with extensive coastlines, major rivers, and the strategic importance of controlling sea lanes, made maritime capability a genuine operational necessity. Accounts from the Sengoku period describe shinobi operations conducted from small boats navigated in silence across harbors and river approaches, with the operatives dressed in minimal clothing and equipped with waterproofed equipment cases to preserve tools and documents against immersion. Naval commanders of the period used shinobi intelligence to assess the defensive strength of enemy ports and the positioning of harbor chains and boom defenses before committing surface forces. Some accounts describe underwater sabotage operations against anchored vessels, a form of maritime covert action that anticipates the combat diver operations of the Second World War by nearly 4 centuries. The sea was not a boundary for the shinobi. Like the mountain, the river, and the dark forest, it was simply another environment, one that rewarded preparation, penalized ignorance, and belonged, ultimately, to whoever understood it best. Strategic thinking, the capacity to see not just the immediate situation but the second, third, and fourth-order consequences of actions across time, was cultivated within the shinobi tradition as rigorously as any physical skill. Training texts describe strategic games and problem-solving exercises used to develop operational planning capacity. Students were presented with complex scenarios and required to identify not just solutions, but the vulnerabilities those solutions created, the countermeasures an intelligent opponent would employ, and the contingency options available when primary plans failed. This emphasis on planning depth reflected a hard operational truth. In covert work, the gap between a good plan and a poor plan was measured not in efficiency but in survival. A soldier with a poor tactical plan might lose the battle. A shinobi with a poor operational plan died alone, far from help, in a place where no one would come looking and no one would know what had happened. The intensity of consequence created, over generations, a tradition of extraordinarily thorough strategic thinking, and a profound, deeply earned respect for the complexity of the world. Signal communication across distance, the ability to coordinate between multiple operatives or between an operative in the field and a support network, required a range of solutions that the shinobi developed with characteristic ingenuity. Fire signals, carefully controlled and coded, could communicate complex status information across mountain distances that no human messenger could traverse quickly. Specific patterns of light, duration, spacing, color altered by different combustibles, created a vocabulary that could only be decoded by someone who knew the key. Some accounts describe the use of mirrors and reflective surfaces during daylight for similar purposes, the equivalent of the heliograph signal systems that European militaries would independently develop centuries later. At shorter ranges, bird calls and animal sounds were used as contact signals, allowing operatives to locate each other in darkness or dense vegetation without producing any sound that a human listener would identify as communication. The sophistication of these communication systems reminds us that the ninja were not solitary wolves. They were nodes in a network, and the network's effectiveness depended on coordination as much as on individual skill. The kunoichi's training in what might be called emotional intelligence operations deserves deeper examination because it represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of the entire tradition. Female operatives were specifically trained in the recognition and exploitation of emotional states, not through manipulation in a cynical or predatory sense, but through a highly developed capacity for reading people. The micro-expressions that flash across a human face in the fraction of a second before social control reimpose a neutral expression. The postural changes that accompany emotional states before conscious awareness can correct them. The vocal patterns, pace, pitch, rhythm, that change when a person is concealing something or operating under stress. This observational capacity, combined with the social invisibility that feudal gender dynamics provided, gave the kunoichi a form of human intelligence capability that was, in many operational contexts, simply unmatched. They could read the emotional weather of a room in the time it took to pour a cup of tea, and everything they read, they remembered. Escape and evasion was not a subset of shinobi training. It was, in terms of the overall operational curriculum, at least as important as infiltration. The problem of getting out of a compromised situation, after an operation had gone wrong, after an identity had been questioned, after a guard had been encountered unexpectedly, required a completely different skill set and a completely different psychological orientation than the problem of getting in. Getting in required patience, precision, and control. Getting out often required instant improvisation, physical intensity, and a specific form of decision-making under extreme stress that was entirely different from the deliberate strategic planning of the approach phase. Training for extraction specifically included scenarios in which everything that could go wrong had already gone wrong, where the operative had to navigate from a position of compromise, with multiple active pursuers, towards safety, using whatever resources happened to be available in the immediate environment. This training for worst-case scenarios reflected a hard-won operational truth. The quality that most reliably distinguishes those who survive from those who do not is not strength or skill, it is the capacity to think clearly in the worst possible moment. The shinobi techniques for silent movement, collectively sometimes referred to as shinobi-ruki or nukiashi, were far more nuanced and physically demanding than simply walking quietly. Different surfaces required completely different movement techniques, and mastery of each surface type was trained as a separate discipline. On tatami floors, a specific rolling footfall technique transferred weight gradually from the outer edge of the foot across to the inner, eliminating the impact sound of heel strike while also minimizing the compression sound of the mat fibers. On wooden floors, the technique shifted to identifying and using the structural support points beneath the boards, places where no flex and therefore no sound was possible. On gravel or loose stone, among the most acoustically challenging surfaces in any infiltration environment, specific sequences of foot placement, weight transfer speed, and stride length were trained to minimize the grinding sound of stone-on-stone contact. And on wet surfaces, which changed the acoustic properties of almost every other surface type, each technique required specific modification. The silent walk was not one skill. It was dozens, each one demanding, each one essential. The employment of shinobi in the famous Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, the climactic conflict that established Tokugawa Ieyasu's dominance over Japan and effectively ended the Sengoku period, is well documented in historical sources, though rarely discussed in popular accounts of the battle. Both sides employed shinobi intelligence networks and covert agents in the months and weeks leading up to the decisive engagement. Tokugawa's intelligence operation, reportedly one of the more sophisticated of the period, included advance agents embedded in the Western Coalition's territory who were providing real-time intelligence on troop movements, supply status, and, critically, the reliability and actual commitment of specific commanders within the opposing coalition. Some historians argue that Tokugawa's success at Sekigahara was as much an intelligence victory as a military one, that the defections and betrayals that shattered the Western Coalition's effectiveness on the day of battle were not spontaneous decisions, but the product of months of careful, patient shinobi influence operations that had been quietly cultivating those defections long before the armies faced each other on the field. With the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century, the operational environment for the shinobi tradition changed fundamentally, and with it, the tradition itself began to transform. The century and a half of near-constant warfare that had made professional covert operatives indispensable ended. Japan entered the Pax Tokugawa, a long period of enforced domestic stability under a highly controlling central government. For the shinobi, this created a profound identity crisis. The skills that had been essential to survival in the Sengoku period were now, in many of their most overtly operational forms, directly threatening to the regime that controlled Japan. The Tokugawa government was deeply suspicious of independent military capability and moved systematically to monopolize and control it. Some shinobi clans were absorbed into the official intelligence apparatus of the shogunate. Most famously, the Iga men who became the Onmitsu, the shogunate's own secret police and intelligence service. Others quietly returned to agricultural life. And the tradition, in both cases, went underground in a new and deeper way. The Onmitsu, the covert surveillance and intelligence service of the Tokugawa shogunate, represented a fascinating institutionalization of shinobi tradition within the formal apparatus of state power. Drawing heavily from Iga and Kōka lineages, the Onmitsu conducted domestic surveillance, investigated disloyalty among the daimyo, the regional lords nominally subordinate to the shogunate, monitored the activities of foreign traders and missionaries, and provided the central government with a continuous stream of intelligence about the social and political state of the country. They also included the famous Metsuke, inspector officials whose role was partly overt oversight and partly covert intelligence collection. The irony was significant. The tradition that had been built in opposition to centralized military power, that had thrived in the cracks of feudal society by serving no single master, now found itself as the instrument of the most comprehensive central government Japan had ever known. The shinobi had not been destroyed by the peace. They had been domesticated by it, which is a different kind of disappearance, and in some ways a sadder one. The mythology of the ninja, the deliberately cultivated supernatural reputation, was one of the most ingenious elements of the tradition's approach to operational security, and understanding it reveals something remarkable about how fear functions as a strategic resource. The shinobi actively encouraged stories of supernatural ability. They performed operations that were, in principle, explicable through skill and preparation, but which appeared to witnesses, particularly frightened, superstitious witnesses encountering them in the dark, as evidence of preternatural powers. The ability to vanish, achieved through smoke devices, pre-prepared concealment positions, and understanding of human visual attention, became evidence of magical transformation. The ability to survive conditions that should have been fatal, achieved through cold resistance training, pharmacological self-preparation, and exceptional physical resilience, became evidence of demonic origin. And the reputation these stories built was operationally valuable in ways that went far beyond individual missions. An enemy who believed their opponents were supernatural was an enemy whose decision-making was already compromised before any operation began. The most powerful weapon the ninja ever created was the mythology of the ninja. The taijutsu component of ninjutsu, the unarmed combat system, was as sophisticated as any martial art in the Japanese tradition, but its design priorities were entirely different from those of the samurai arts. Where samurai empty-hand techniques were often designed as supplements to armed combat, ways of managing a situation when the sword was unavailable, shinobi taijutsu was designed from the ground up around the specific demands of covert operations. This meant absolute prioritization of rapid incapacitation with minimal noise. Strikes targeting the throat, the temple, and specific nerve clusters that produced near-instantaneous unconsciousness. Joint manipulation techniques capable of controlling and silencing a person before they had time to cry out. And, critically, methods for disengaging from contact instantly and returning to concealment or flight, because the worst possible outcome in most shinobi operational scenarios was not a lost fight but a prolonged fight. Every second of physical engagement was a second during which discovery, alarm, or reinforcement could occur. The best fight was the one that ended before it began. And the second best was the one that ended in the first second. The knowledge of human anatomy within the shinobi tradition was both medicinal and tactical. and the two applications were not as distinct as they might initially appear. Understanding the body's vulnerabilities for combat purposes required the same knowledge that understanding the body's healing required, and the tradition maintained both dimensions as complementary aspects of a unified physical philosophy. Specific pressure points and anatomical targets were catalogued with a precision that reflects genuine empirical study, not merely inherited theory, but knowledge tested and refined through direct practice. The Kyusho, vital points, of the human body were mapped not just for their capacity to cause unconsciousness or death, but for their potential to cause specific types and durations of incapacitation that served particular operational needs. Temporary paralysis of a limb without permanent damage. Disorientation sufficient to allow restraint without causing injury that would raise medical questions later. And yes, lethal applications, but understood precisely enough to be applied selectively rather than by default. The shinobi body was a library of consequences, and the operative's knowledge of the human body was the key to reading it. The concept of zanshin, remaining mind, or sustained awareness, was a principle shared across several Japanese martial and artistic traditions, but within the shinobi curriculum it had a specific and unusually intense practical application. In most traditions, zanshin referred to a state of alert readiness maintained after the completion of a technique, the continued awareness that prevented complacency in the moment between actions. For the shinobi, it extended into the complete operational cycle. The same quality of awareness that was required during active operation needed to be sustained in preparation, in recovery, and critically, during those transitional moments. The approach to a target area, the withdrawal after mission completion, when the human tendency to relax prematurely was most dangerous. Historical accounts document that many shinobi casualties occurred not during the operation itself, but in the withdrawal phase, when the psychological pressure of the active work had released, the adrenaline was fading, and the deeply human impulse to believe the danger was over created a fatal vulnerability. Zanshin was the discipline of refusing to believe the danger was ever completely over. The kusarigama, a sickle attached to a length of chain with a weighted end, was among the most unusual and operationally versatile weapons in the shinobi toolkit, and its design embodies the tradition's characteristic preference for multifunctionality. The weighted chain could be swung to entangle an opponent's weapon or limbs, immobilizing them for a follow-up strike from the sickle blade. Thrown with the weight, it could wrap around an opponent at range, turning distance into an advantage rather than a neutral factor. Used differently, the chain could be employed for climbing or restraint. The sickle blade itself functioned as an agricultural tool, providing a cover identity for carrying the weapon. And the chain, detached from the sickle, became a flexible striking weapon in its own right. The kusarigama required years of training to use effectively because its multiple components could interfere with each other in unpracticed hands, wrapping around the user rather than the target in ways that were deeply problematic. But in expert hands, it created a combat range and tactical flexibility that standard weapons simply could not match. It was impractical to master, which is why mastering it was exactly the point. The shinobi tradition's knowledge of plant life extended beyond pharmacology into what might be called environmental botany, the use of vegetation as operational infrastructure. Certain plants, when crushed and applied, could reduce or alter the scent signature of a human body. Others, burned, produced smoke with specific visual characteristics useful for different types of concealment. Dense white smoke for covering a withdrawal across open ground, dark smoke for signaling. Some were used as natural dyes to alter the color of clothing quickly and convincingly in the field. Knowledge of edible wild plants was essential for extended field operations that required sustained presence in wilderness areas without supply support. And the location and seasonal availability of specific vegetation types was used as a navigation and timing reference, a form of environmental clock and compass that operated independently of any manufactured instrument. The natural world, read with sufficient botanical knowledge, provided the shinobi with a complete operational support system that required no logistics chain, left no supply trail, and could not be interdicted by any enemy force. One of the most remarkable and least discussed aspects of the shinobi tradition is its deep engagement with performing arts, not merely as a cover identity, but as a genuine intellectual and technical resource. The Japanese performing traditions of No, Kaijin, and later Kabuki were studied by shinobi not for their aesthetic content, but for what they revealed about human psychology and the mechanics of believable performance. How does a skilled actor create genuine emotional response in an audience? What physical signals, posture, breath, vocal quality, microexpression, communicate inner states with such reliability that an observer cannot help but believe them? Understanding this from a performer's perspective meant understanding it from a deceiver's perspective and a detector's perspective. A shinobi who understood how believable performance was constructed was simultaneously better at maintaining a false identity under pressure, better at detecting false identities in others, and better at understanding which elements of a human performance were most difficult to fake convincingly. Art, in other words, was intelligence training. Beauty was a technology of survival. The ethics of the shinobi tradition, a topic almost never addressed in popular representations, were both more developed and more complicated than the moral simplicity of assassins for hire that popular culture suggests. The Bansonshuki and other major texts are explicit. Ninjutsu was not to be practiced for personal gain or private vendetta. It was to be used in service of legitimate authority and in the defense of genuine security interests. Operatives who used their skills for personal enrichment or for causes that violated these principles were considered to have fundamentally corrupted their practice, not merely broken a rule, but destroyed the very thing that made their training meaningful. This ethical framework was not simply window dressing. It reflected a sophisticated understanding that covert capabilities, unmoored from ethical constraint, become existential threats to the very social fabric that makes human community possible. The shinobi tradition had watched enough societies collapse under the weight of unconstrained political violence to understand this with a clarity that many more powerful and more celebrated institutions never achieved. The transition from active operative to teacher, from the field to the dojo, was, within the shinobi tradition, a carefully managed and philosophically significant passage. The most valuable knowledge was always held by those with the most operational experience, and the transmission of that knowledge required a depth of trust between master and student that could only be developed over years of close, carefully observed relationship. A shinobi master did not simply teach techniques. They transmitted a complete worldview, a way of perceiving and interacting with reality that had been forged in the specific crucible of high-stakes covert work. The patience to observe without reacting. The discipline to endure without complaining. The clarity to decide without hesitating. These qualities could not be explained in a lecture or demonstrated in a technique. They could only be transmitted through the long, slow process of shared practice, through the experience of being watched, evaluated, and gradually trusted with progressively more difficult and consequential challenges. Mastery in the shinobi tradition was never awarded. It was earned, slowly, in the only way anything real has ever been earned. Water, in the shinobi philosophical framework, was not merely a tactical medium, it was a fundamental metaphor for the ideal state of the operative's mind. The Bansonshuki explicitly invokes water as a model, perfectly adaptable to any container, impossible to grasp, capable of wearing away stone through patient persistence, and able to find its way through any barrier, however solid. A mind that functioned like water, responsive without being reactive, persistent without being rigid, flowing toward its objective along whatever path presented itself, was considered the highest psychological achievement that shinobi training could produce. This was not passive resignation. It was, as the tradition understood it, the most active and powerful orientation possible, because it preserved full capacity for decisive action while remaining completely unattached to any particular path or method. The shinobi did not succeed because they were more determined than their opponents. They succeeded because they were more adaptable. And adaptation, the tradition taught, begins always with the willingness to let go of the plan you had and become fully present to the situation you are actually in. Field medicine, the capacity to treat injuries during or after an operation without external support, in conditions of complete concealment, was a standard component of the shinobi curriculum and reflected the tradition's characteristic emphasis on self-sufficiency. An operative who was injured mid-mission and could not manage that injury independently was an operative who might be discovered, who might be captured, who might leave a blood trail, or who might simply die before completing their objective. Training in wound management included specific techniques for controlling bleeding silently, without the involuntary vocalizations that pain tends to produce, treating puncture wounds, managing fractures sufficiently to maintain mobility, and addressing the physiological effects of specific toxins that an operative might encounter either accidentally or through deliberate enemy action. Some texts describe specific herbal preparations carried as standard field medical kit, not merely for treatment, but for pain management in ways that preserved cognitive function rather than inducing the soporific effects of many conventional medicines of the period. Even in injury, the shinobi remained operational. The alternative was not an option. The strategic use of social events, festivals, religious ceremonies, public gatherings, formal court occasions, as intelligence collection opportunities was a well-developed component of shinobi operational doctrine. These events created conditions of unusual social mixing, where information normally protected behind castle walls circulated more freely. Lords spoke to lords without the formal barriers of official protocol. Servants heard things that servants did not normally hear. The general social loosening produced by celebration, alcohol, and the temporary suspension of normal hierarchical vigilance created windows of vulnerability that a prepared, patient observer could exploit with remarkable productivity. Shinobi embedded within the service staff of major events could, in a single evening, collect intelligence equivalent to weeks of conventional surveillance. The difficulty was not access. Social events were, by definition, attended by many people, but behavioral discipline, maintaining the specific, believable performance of a service role across hours of high stimulation, high information environment without breaking cover, without drawing attention, and without missing anything important. The Ninki, the shinobi's toolkit, was a carefully curated collection of items that balanced operational capability against the requirements of maintaining a convincing cover identity during travel. Too many unusual items and the pack of a traveling monk, or merchant's assistant, became unconvincing under inspection. Too few and the operative was inadequately equipped for the range of contingencies their mission might present. Surviving accounts and recovered examples suggest a typical operational kit might include fire-starting materials, a small selection of pharmaceutical preparations, climbing aids, communication materials including writing implements and coded reference documents, specialized edge tools, several types of concealment and distraction devices, and field medical supplies. Every item was chosen for maximum functional overlap with innocent civilian use. The same rope used for climbing could be a merchant's packing material. The same chemical preparation that produced smoke for concealment could be explained as a trade good. The line between the shinobi's toolkit and the ordinary equipment of a feudal Japanese traveler was deliberately, carefully, methodically blurred, because the line between the ninja and the ordinary person was the tradition's most important secret. Endurance training in the shinobi tradition extended into systematic exposure to adverse environmental conditions, not to build simple physical toughness, but to eliminate the psychological resistance to environmental hardship that degrades operational performance. Extended periods in cold water. Sustained movement through difficult terrain in rain, darkness, and fog. Prolonged physical activity under conditions of caloric restriction that tested the body's capacity to maintain performance on minimal fuel. The goal was not to make these conditions pleasant, it was to make them operationally neutral. An operative who was distracted by cold, who was cognitively compromised by hunger, who made worse decisions because they were wet and tired was an operative who had not finished training. The environment was never supposed to be comfortable. The training was designed to make the environment irrelevant, to create a practitioner for whom the external conditions, however harsh, were simply the conditions under which the work needed to be done. This philosophy has been independently arrived at by elite military training programs across the modern world. The principle, it seems, is universal. The shinobi simply understood it earlier than most. Psychological operations against enemy leadership, what modern military doctrine would call PSYOP, were among the most sophisticated and strategically impactful tools in the shinobi repertoire. A well-designed operation could render a powerful military commander ineffective without ever exposing an operative to physical risk. The discovery of evidence suggesting that a key advisor was a traitor could shatter the trust within an enemy command structure and paralyze strategic decision-making. Apparently supernatural occurrences, arranged by skilled operatives using technical means, within the personal living spaces of superstitious commanders could produce genuine psychological crisis. The interception and subtle alteration of communications between allied commanders could introduce misunderstandings that produced hesitation or, in better cases, actual conflict between forces that should have been coordinating. Each of these operations required patient, careful preparation, precise execution, and complete absence of attribution. And each of them could achieve more strategic effect than the most impressive conventional military action, at a fraction of the risk, using a fraction of the resources. The shinobi did not underestimate the power of the human mind. They built their entire operational doctrine around it. The geographic reach of shinobi intelligence networks at their operational peak has been significantly underestimated in most historical accounts. The tendency to think of the ninja in terms of individual operatives or even small clans misses the network dimension. The fact that the major Iga and Kōka lineages had, at various points during the Sengoku period, informant relationships, allied operatives, and embedded agents across enormous geographic areas. This reach was the product of generations of deliberate relationship building, the cultivation of contacts among the merchants, monks, performers, and other mobile populations whose legitimate activities took them across provincial boundaries. Each of these contacts was a node in a network that could, when activated, transmit information from one end of Japan to the other in days. No single person in the network knew its full extent. No single capture or defection could expose its entire architecture. It was, in modern intelligence terms, a classic network of networks, robust, resilient, and extraordinarily difficult to destroy comprehensively because it had no central vulnerability. The network was the weapon, and the weapon had no handle that anyone could grab. Children occupied a specific and fascinatingly ambiguous position within shinobi intelligence operations, and this is one of the more disquieting aspects of the tradition's operational history. In a society where children moved freely and attracted minimal adult suspicion, a trained child courier could carry messages through checkpoints, between safe houses, and across social boundaries that adults could not navigate as easily. The feudal Japanese checkpoint system, the sekisho that controlled movement between provinces, was specifically designed to monitor adult travelers, particularly adult men. A child with a legitimate errand was, in the checkpoint guard's mental model, essentially invisible. Historical accounts from the period describe children as routine components of intelligence communication systems, and some suggest that in communities with deep shinobi traditions, basic observational and communication training began for children at ages that most people today would find extraordinary. The tradition's ruthless practicality extended even here, to the recognition that in a world where information meant survival, every available resource needed to be understood and, where appropriate, utilized. The question of what happened to shinobi who were captured is one that historical sources address only obliquely, and the obliqueness is itself revealing. The conventions of the period provided for the execution of spies without the protections extended to captured warriors, meaning that a shinobi taken alive faced an outcome that was not merely death but typically a death designed to extract information before it arrived. The training that addressed this reality was not primarily physical. Torture resistance has physiological limits that training cannot meaningfully extend, but psychological and operational. Compartmentalization of information was essential. Operatives were told only what they needed to know for their specific mission, so that the maximum damage achievable through a single capture was strictly limited. Certain false information was deliberately learned in ways designed to be believed under interrogation. And there was, in the tradition's darkest recess, what the texts address with characteristic indirectness: the preparation for the possibility that capture and the interrogation that followed could be avoided entirely. The tradition was honest about what its work could cost. That honesty was part of the training. The lasting influence of the shinobi tradition on subsequent Japanese culture is both profound and profoundly strange. Strange because it operates largely through absence, through the things that were deliberately not recorded, not credited, not acknowledged. The intelligence services of the Tokugawa shogunate, the police systems of the Meiji period, and certain strands of Japanese military intelligence in the modern era all contain conceptual DNA from the shinobi tradition, organizational principles, collection methodologies, and psychological frameworks that survived the transition from feudal covert operation to modern state intelligence because they worked, and because things that work tend to persist regardless of how thoroughly the culture that created them changes. The specific techniques mutated. The specific vocabulary was updated. But the fundamental insights about human nature, about the mechanics of deception, about the relationship between information and power, proved robust across centuries of social transformation. The ninja did not leave a monument. They left a methodology. And methodologies, when they are good enough, are nearly impossible to kill. Ninjutsu as a living martial tradition survived into the modern era through several lineages, most famously through the Togakuryu school claimed to be transmitted through Masaaki Hatsumi, who founded the Bujinkan organization in the 20th century and brought systematic ninjutsu instruction to an international audience. The authenticity of specific lineage claims within modern ninjutsu schools is a subject of ongoing and occasionally heated academic and practitioner debate, and the debate itself reveals something important about how difficult it is to verify continuous transmission of a tradition that was, by design, never transparently documented. What is not in question is that interest in ninjutsu as a practical discipline grew dramatically in the latter half of the 20th century, producing a global community of practitioners, researchers, and enthusiasts who have contributed genuinely to the historical and technical understanding of the tradition. The shinobi, who spent centuries cultivating invisibility, became in the modern era perhaps the world's most globally recognized and obsessively studied class of historical warrior. The irony would likely not be lost on them. The popular mythology of the ninja, the Hollywood version, the video game version, the children's toy version, bears a relationship to historical reality that is complicated, layered, and more interesting than simple dismissal as fantasy allows. Some elements of the popular image are surprisingly accurate. The emphasis on stealth over direct combat, the use of specialized tools, the deployment of psychological tactics, the connection to specific Japanese regions and traditions. Others are pure invention or dramatic amplification, the supernatural powers, the constant all-black costume, the preference for rooftop approach as a standard infiltration method, the throwing star as a primary weapon. But there is something important in the fact that the mythology persists with such extraordinary global reach across so many different cultural contexts. It suggests that the shinobi tapped into something genuinely universal, a deep human fascination with the person who operates outside visible power, who moves through the world's defenses like water through sand, who is never where you look and always where you don't. That archetype predates the ninja. But the ninja gave it its most compelling historical face. The parallels between documented shinobi operational doctrine and the training and doctrine of modern special operations forces are close enough and specific enough to have attracted serious attention from military historians and special operations community members. The emphasis on intelligence preparation before action. The principle of achieving objectives through minimum force and maximum information. The systematic training for adverse environmental conditions. The psychological preparation for operating under extreme stress. The compartmentalization of information within operational cells. The doctrine of deception, misdirection, and the exploitation of the adversary's cognitive vulnerabilities. None of these principles are identical across the historical distance. The specific techniques, tools, and organizational structures are completely different. But the philosophical architecture, the underlying understanding of what covert operations require and how they should be conducted, maps with a closeness that is not coincidental. Both traditions are attempting to solve the same problem. And the problem, being a product of permanent features of human nature and conflict, has permanent features in its solution. The concept of mushin, no mind, or the state of consciousness where action arises without deliberate conscious thought, connects the shinobi tradition to the broader stream of Japanese spiritual and artistic practice in ways that reveal a unified philosophical worldview beneath the surface diversity of the tradition's many techniques and disciplines. In combat, Mushin described the state of a practitioner so thoroughly trained that response arose spontaneously, without the delay of conscious deliberation, the ideal endpoint of years of repetitive practice, where the gap between perception and action effectively disappeared. But in the shinobi framework, Mushin extended beyond combat into all aspects of operation: the spontaneous adaptation to unexpected developments, the instinctive reading of complex social situations, the immediate identification of concealment opportunity in an unfamiliar environment. These capacities, the tradition held, could not be achieved by intelligence or intention alone. They required practice so sustained and so deeply embedded in the body and the unconscious mind that the practitioner's accumulated experience became available instantly, without the friction of thought. In the critical moment, hesitation was the enemy. And the antidote to hesitation was a lifetime of disciplined preparation. Navigation at night and in unfamiliar terrain, a fundamental operational requirement for any tradition that worked primarily in darkness and in the field, was addressed in the shinobi curriculum through both technical knowledge and what might be called environmental fluency. Celestial navigation, using the stars for directional orientation and time estimation, was standard training. But beyond the stars, the shinobi developed an extraordinary sensitivity to the full range of environmental directional cues: the dominant growth patterns of moss on tree trunks, the habitual flight paths of certain birds at dawn and dusk, the direction of prevailing winds encoded in the shapes of trees over time, the drainage patterns of terrain that always ultimately pointed toward water. These cues, individually unreliable, became collectively robust when read simultaneously and cross-referenced, creating a picture of location and direction from nothing but attentive observation of the environment. An operative who could read nature this fluently was, in a very real sense, never lost. Because the world, read carefully enough, always knows exactly where it is. And it will tell you if you have learned its language. The tradecraft of the Shinobi Information Network, the specific practices used to pass intelligence, confirm identities, and coordinate operations without direct acknowledged contact, was among the most sophisticated and least documented aspects of the entire tradition. What survives in historical texts is necessarily incomplete, because the value of these practices depended on their secrecy, meaning the most effective ones were the least likely to be written down. But enough survives to reconstruct the outlines, recognition signals embedded in ordinary social behavior, a specific way of placing objects, a particular conversational phrase that meant something different to the initiated than to a casual listener, physical gestures encoded into the ritual behavior of legitimate social roles. The anonymous exchange of written communications through pre-agreed location drops. Identity verification through challenge and response protocols that appeared, to any witness, as casual small talk. Each of these practices was designed to be completely transparent to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, and completely legible to anyone who was. Information security, the shinobi understood, does not require complexity. It requires invisibility. The human impulse that produced the shinobi, the drive to operate outside visible structures of power, to gather information without being seen gathering it, to influence events from positions of invisibility, predates Japan by millennia and has never really gone away. It is present in the diplomatic intelligence operations of ancient Mesopotamia, in the spy networks of the Roman Empire, in the covert operatives deployed by Renaissance Italian city-states, in the industrial espionage networks of the Victorian era, and in the vast, technologically enhanced covert apparatus of the modern world, where satellite surveillance, digital intelligence gathering, and psychological influence operations are conducted at scales and speeds that would have been literally incomprehensible to a shinobi of the Sengoku period. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The human need to know what others are doing, to shape events invisibly, to maintain advantage through information, has not changed at all. The ninja did not invent this need. They simply answered it, in their time and their place, with a completeness and a sophistication that still commands respect nearly 5 centuries later. Among the most frequently overlooked facts about the shinobi tradition is the fundamental role of intellectual development, literacy, strategic reading, and the active study of history and political philosophy in the formation of an effective operative. The popular image of the ninja as a purely physical practitioner, a body without politics, is almost the inverse of the historical reality. The major shinobi lineages maintained libraries. They studied the great Chinese strategic texts, not just the art of war, but the 36 stratagems, the writings of Wu Qi, the military philosophy of the Warring States period. They analyzed the political histories of Japan and China for pattern recognition, for the recurring dynamics of how power structures rose, became vulnerable, and fell. An operative without this intellectual background could execute a physical task efficiently but could not understand its strategic context, could not evaluate its political implications, and could not adapt intelligently when that context changed in unexpected ways. The shinobi who survived to become masters were not simply the most physically capable. They were the most comprehensively intelligent, in every sense of that word. The written records of the shinobi tradition present scholars with a peculiar interpretive challenge, because the most important texts were deliberately written in ways that made their full meaning inaccessible to anyone who had not received corresponding oral instruction. The Bansonshuki, the most comprehensive surviving text, is full of passages that read as clear strategic or philosophical guidance at the surface level but that contain embedded layers of technical instruction visible only to someone already familiar with the specific practices being described. Other texts used agricultural metaphors so extensively that they read, to an uninitiated eye, as farming manuals, complete with detailed discussions of soil management and seasonal planting schedules that were, in context, coded discussions of intelligence preparation methodology. This deliberate layering of meaning created records that were both durable, because they appeared too mundane to destroy, and secure, because they were effectively unreadable to anyone without the tradition's internal interpretive framework. The text was a key, and the lock that it opened was elsewhere, in living memory, in the body of practice, in the unwritten knowledge that passed from master to student, in the long, patient relationship at the heart of the tradition. The relationship between the shinobi master and their most trusted students was, in the tradition's idealized form, one of the closest human bonds that feudal Japanese society produced, closer, in many ways, than family, because it was founded not on accident of birth but on deliberate, tested, repeatedly reaffirmed mutual commitment. The master's investment in a senior student was total, not merely technical instruction, but the formation of character, the development of judgment, the transmission of the philosophical worldview that gave all the technical knowledge its meaning and direction. And the student's obligation was correspondingly comprehensive, not simply to learn the techniques, but to demonstrate, through years of practice and increasingly challenging real-world application, that they had internalized the values that made those techniques legitimate to use. This was not a transactional relationship. It was something closer to what the best mentorship traditions in any field aspire to, the complete transfer of a mature perspective from one human being to another, across the irreducible distance of individual experience, through the patient, imperfect, miraculous medium of sustained personal relationship. What happened to the individual shinobi as they aged, as the extraordinary physical capabilities that defined their operational effectiveness in youth inevitably declined, tells us something important about how the tradition understood the relationship between physical skill and wisdom. The older master's role was not diminished when their body was no longer capable of what it once was. It became, in many respects, more important, because the judgment that decades of operational experience produced was irreplaceable by any amount of physical capability. The most valuable thing a shinobi master possessed in old age was not a weapon or a technique. It was a model of reality, built from decades of observing human behavior under the most revealing conditions possible, from every angle, in every type of light. How people behaved when they were afraid. How they behaved when they were confident and should not have been. What trust looked like and what trust performed looked like. The difference between these was the difference between a good operative and a dead one. And only time could teach it. The aesthetic sensibility of the shinobi tradition, and it did have one, deeply embedded in its philosophical foundations, ran contrary to the bold, beautiful, publicly performed aesthetics of the samurai culture it existed alongside. Where the samurai found beauty in the dramatic, the visible, the glorious, the perfectly timed sword stroke, the heroic death, the shinobi tradition found something else entirely, the beauty of perfect function achieved without any observable trace. The operation completed so cleanly that no one could be certain it was an operation at all. The information gathered without leaving the slightest disturbance in the world it had been gathered from. The problem solved in a way that created no new problems. This aesthetic, which has no common name in Western aesthetic philosophy but might be described as the beauty of invisible precision, is present in the great Japanese arts of gardening, of the tea ceremony, of calligraphy. The trace of the master's hand is present everywhere in the work, and yet the work appears effortless, natural, inevitable. The shinobi aspired to make their work indistinguishable from the natural unfolding of events. That, in their tradition, was the highest art. The kakushibeya, hidden rooms built into the architecture of estates and residences associated with shinobi traditions, represent one of the most tangible and still discoverable physical artifacts of the ninja world, and their design reveals a sophisticated understanding of spatial psychology that goes beyond simple concealment. These were not merely spaces behind false walls. They were carefully engineered environments that accounted for acoustic leakage, for airflow that would prevent the concealed occupant from suffocating, for lines of sight that allowed observation through the wall without corresponding observation from outside. Some incorporated mechanisms for emergency egress that could be operated silently and quickly from inside. Others were positioned not in the obvious places, behind bookshelves, beneath floor hatches, but in the spaces that systematic search would logically eliminate. Inside structural columns that appeared too narrow to contain a person, within the double walls of certain architectural features, in spaces only accessible through other already concealed spaces. The people who built these rooms understood searcher psychology as intimately as they understood construction. The best hiding place is not the most concealed one. It is the one that the searcher's own assumptions make them certain doesn't exist. The concept of Furenkazan, wind, forest, fire, mountain, was a strategic principle drawn from Sun Tzu and famously adopted by the great warlord Takeda Shingen as his battle standard. But within the shinobi tradition, this same principle had a specific operational interpretation that went beyond its conventional military application. Swift as wind, the capacity for rapid decision and action without hesitation. Silent as forest, the ability to achieve complete stillness, to make no disturbance, to exist without evidence. Fierce as fire, the total commitment to action once action was decided upon, without reservation or restraint. Immovable as mountain, the psychological stability that could not be shaken by surprise, by threat, by adversity, or by the emotional weight of extraordinary events. These four qualities together described not a tactic or a technique, but a complete psychological orientation, the ideal inner state from which all effective action arose. The shinobi did not simply try to act correctly. They trained to become the kind of person for whom correct action arose naturally as wind moves, as inevitably as fire burns, as permanently as a mountain stands. The relationship between the shinobi and the forest was elemental, not merely tactical, but psychological and philosophical. The great forests of medieval Japan were, in the cultural imagination of the period, liminal spaces, boundary zones between the human and the supernatural, between the known and the unknowable, inhabited by spirits and forces that operated outside ordinary human understanding. For the shinobi, who worked in these spaces deliberately and competently, this supernatural reputation was simultaneously a protection and a statement. A person who moved through the forest in darkness, who understood its sounds and its silences, who knew which animals would warn and which would conceal, that person was, in the perception of the surrounding society, something other than ordinary. Something that operated by rules different from those that governed visible human life. And that perception, cultivated carefully, became a shield of a very specific kind. Not physical, but social. The forest-born mystery of the shinobi was not incidental to their operational effectiveness. It was, in the deepest sense, one of their most carefully maintained weapons. The principles of the shinobi tradition did not die with the feudal era that produced them. They migrated into the intelligence services and special forces of modern states, into the philosophy of certain martial arts traditions, into the management literature of strategic business thinking, into the competitive intelligence practices of modern corporations, and into the creative work of artists, writers, and filmmakers who keep returning to the archetype because it continues to mean something to them. The specific application has changed beyond recognition. The principle that the most powerful actor in any complex environment is often the one who understands the most, controls their own behavior most completely, and reveals the least about their capabilities and intentions has not changed at all. Power through knowledge, control through discipline, presence through absence. These are not feudal Japanese ideas. They are permanent human discoveries about the nature of effectiveness in a world that is always more complex, more surveilled, and more dangerous than it appears. The shinobi found them first, but they belong to everyone who is willing to do the work. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the shinobi tradition is not any specific technique, not any particular historical operation, not even the sheer operational sophistication of a pre-modern covert capability that in many respects rivals modern standards. The most remarkable thing is the completeness of vision that produced it. The people of Iga and Kōka, operating in a brutal and politically chaotic world without access to any of the institutional resources that modern states bring to intelligence and covert operations, built something genuinely comprehensive, a tradition that addressed not just the physical dimensions of covert work, not just the technical dimensions, but the psychological, the philosophical, the ethical, and the spiritual dimensions as well. They understood, at a depth that is still impressive, that truly effective covert capability required not just skilled operatives, but whole human beings, people whose character, judgment, and inner life were as developed as their technical skills. The blade and the heart, both always together. They built a tradition for the whole person. And in doing so, they built something that has outlasted, by centuries, every single fortress and every single army that the Sengoku period produced. We began this journey in the dark, as the shinobi always did. And now, 2 hours later, we emerge into something that is not quite light and not quite darkness, but the space between them, which is, perhaps appropriately, exactly where the ninja always lived. 100 facts. And yet the feeling that remains is not of completion, but of depth, of a tradition that has more beneath its surface than we have had time to reach. Because the truth about the shinobi is that their greatest achievement was not any single operation, not any specific technique, not even the extraordinary network they built across the mountains and valleys of feudal Japan. Their greatest achievement was this. They understood, with a clarity that very few traditions in human history have matched, that the self is both the primary instrument and the primary obstacle. That every physical skill, every technical knowledge, every strategic principle becomes available or unavailable based entirely on the quality of the inner life that applies them. They train the body to move without sound. They train the mind to see without being seen. They train the heart, and this is the part that the movies always miss, to endure without needing to be recognized. To do important work in complete obscurity. To find meaning not in credit, not in glory, not in the visible performance of capability, but in the simple, profound, irreducible satisfaction of a difficult thing done exactly right, in the dark, by someone who will never be known for having done it. In a world that has never been more obsessed with visibility, with performance, with the demonstration of capability for an audience, that particular form of mastery is not less relevant than it was 500 years ago. It may be more relevant than it has ever been. Blade above the heart. The one who endures, unseen, moves the world, and rests.